I guess they thought we were going to, make the sand black or something. Because Lido had the whitest sand in the world, but we couldn't swim there.
From 1945 to 1964, wade-ins were a strategy used by African American civil rights activists to desegregate beaches and swimming pools across the American South. Black activists waded in the water at whites-only beaches and pools, demanding equal access through their presence. Though not as famous as the iconic lunch counter sit-ins, wade-ins played an important role in the fight for equality. Activists combined the nonviolent protest at beaches and at pools with diplomacy and debate, both political and legal, to challenge the status quo and make waves. After the emancipation and the granting of citizenship to formerly enslaved people, racist Southern governments adopted Jim Crow laws to oppress African Americans. These laws systematically discriminated against Black people through the segregation of almost all aspects of public life: schools, bathrooms, buses, and beaches. The nonviolent protests of the civil rights movement, including wade-ins, successfully swayed public opinion and paved the way for the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
10 years later, the civil rights movement was picking up across the country, and acts of civil disobedience became much more common. In Sarasota, Florida, Lido Beach became a heavily contested area. Though African Americans paid taxes to support public amenities like everyone else, they were not allowed access to Sarasota's notoriously beautiful beaches. There weren't any signs posted or laws that banned African Americans from Lido Beach, but there was an unwritten rule prohibiting their access. Residents of Newtown, the Black community near Lido, were forced to drive 20 miles to find a place to swim. Children often learned to swim in ditches. After years of empty promises from the city for access to a beach or pool, Newtown residents took action. On October 3, 1955, roughly 100 African Americans piled into caravans and made their way to Lido Beach under the leadership of Neil Humphrey, president of the Sarasota NAACP. The city of Sarasota tried to stop the caravans from parking. When that failed, white beachgoers took up the response.
There were things that were said to us that was not nice. We were called names. We were told to go back where we come from, that we didn't own the beach, it wasn't ours. But we were determined that we were going to wait.
In addition to just verbal insults, the protesters were pelted with glass bottles and nails were left under their car tires. None of that stopped them from waiting. And as they waited, they sang "Wade in the Water," originally a symbol of protest and freedom during the Underground Railroad, but reclaimed by Sarasota waiters. At Lido Beach occurred every Sunday, week after week, month after month, year after year. To try to appease the activists and keep the tourism industry from suffering, the city of Sarasota attempted a diplomatic compromise through their proposal of an all-black pool. This sparked intense debate among leaders of the movement. Many of the demonstrators were enraged, frustrated that the city refused to take their demands seriously and wanting to dismiss any form of compromise. Others wanted to cut their losses. Compromise was reached when activists decided to not just settle for one. On the day of the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the pool, activists celebrated their victory before immediately turning around and staging another wade-in. And a few years after the passage of the Civil Rights Act, beaches became fully integrated. The bravery of Newtown residents made waves, but the wade-ins across Florida weren't over yet.
At roughly the same time as the Sarasota wade-ins, Black people in Delray faced being denied access to the municipal beach and pool. After a lawsuit for equal access to public amenities was debated and dismissed in federal court, wade-ins began. In May of 1956, a large group of Black protesters took to Delray Beach, only to be surrounded and harassed by white beachgoers. The police shut down the beach immediately. In response, the City Commission held an emergency meeting the next day in which they passed ordinances that both prohibited Black people from the beach and a resolution that excluded their neighborhood from the city limits. Unsurprisingly, many were enraged. A local news channel organized a meeting between the Civic League, an all-black organization that was lobbying for a pool and beach, and the City Commission in order to hear the perspectives of both groups. Surprisingly, the two groups reached an agreement within a few hours at the televised meeting. The exclusion resolution was immediately dropped, a plan for a pool for black people was pushed through, and both groups agreed to continue looking into finding property for a beach open to African Americans. The biracial committee was extremely successful in mediating the dispute and maintained the promises that were made.
We feel that it will succeed because all of us will it to succeed.
In June of 1964, the Senate was in gridlock over national civil rights legislation. A group of SCLC activists, under the leadership of Dr. King, decided they needed to do something to gain national attention and show the extreme racism that black people were facing. The Munson Motor Lodge, one of the most prominent tourist destinations in St. Augustine, Florida, was chosen as the ideal location for such a protest. Around 1 p.m. on June 18, 1964, two white hotel patrons invited 5 African Americans to the segregated hotel as their guests. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and a group of rabbis were across the street in a park to ensure that the press was nearby. The plan went off without a hitch, and the protesters all dove into the Munson Motor Lodge pool. When the group calmly tried to explain they were guests of registered hotel patrons, hotel owner James Brock began screaming irrationally and ordered them to evacuate the pool. The activists refused. Brock ran to his office and grabbed 2 gallons of muriatic acid, a highly corrosive and extremely dangerous outdoor cleaner. Brock shouted, "I am cleaning the pool right now," and dumped gallons of the corrosive chemical into the pool, aiming for the swimmers. The protesters were eventually forced out of the pool by police and were put into handcuffs.
Nonetheless, this highly publicized event was a tipping point. On June 19th, just one day later, Congress approved the Civil Rights Act of 1964, ending contentious debate and a record-setting filibuster. Congressmen who glanced at the front of the newspaper the morning of the vote would have seen images of Brock pouring acid on non-violent protesters. Many attribute the approval of the Civil Rights Act at least partially to the coverage of that wait-in. On July 2nd, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 on live television, banning the discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, or national origin. It also banned racial segregation in public accommodation. The Civil Rights Act was a big step in the right direction, but it still didn't mean that years of racism and tension immediately disappeared. Sarasota and other cities responded to the Civil Rights Act by passing new ordinances to resegregate the beaches. When the Munson Motor Lodge finally integrated, it was targeted by the KKK and firebombed. In St. Augustine, a group of black people went to the beach after the passage of the Civil Rights Act.
See the state troopers in the water, literally forming a boundary between whites and blacks. What happened is that the white people turned on the state troopers. The white people attacked the police. The white people there attacked cameramen.
That being said, over time, beaches and other public amenities began to integrate, and racially charged violence became rarer by the day. In just 20 or 30 years, African Americans went from learning how to swim in ditches and dangerous beaches to swimming in the most beautiful and safe beaches Florida has to offer. Years later, the bravery of waders across Florida and African Americans across the country served as a template in the fight against apartheid in South Africa. South Africans looked toward the success of beach protests on Florida beaches and staged multiple of their own to protest the completely segregated system. Nonviolent protest for racial justice has taken the national stage more recently in the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020. The forgotten wait-ins across Florida exemplify the courage and sheer determination demonstrated by black people across America during the Civil Rights Movement. Waiters attempted to solve the problem through diplomatic channels, such as lawsuits and the formation of biracial committees, but resorted in most cases to informal debates and challenging segregated beaches through nonviolent protests. Florida wait-ins successfully shaped the course of history and racial equality in America.